Hollywick Green was the sort of village that appeared to have been laid out by a kindly hand, with a fondness for symmetry and quietude. Its hedges were clipped to neat obedience. Its cottages wore ivy-like shawls, and its people observed one another's habits with the same devotion they gave to tending roses, or wiping the brass on their gate-latches. On this particular morning, the sun spilled like golden syrup over the green, where the local Women's Institute had set up for the annual Hollywick Harvest Fair. Tables were being arranged with homemade jams, pickled beetroot, and lacework so fine it might have been dreamt into being. Children in mismatched socks chased each other between hay bales, and the air smelled faintly of cider and chimney soot. Miss Marple, who was visiting her distant cousin Hester Lanning for the week, sat beneath a white parasol just beyond the bustle. She wore her usual dove grey and held her knitting loosely, a soft blue cardigan for the church raffle. Her needles moved with idle ease, but her eyes missed nothing, not the hushed bickering between the vicar's wife and the baker's daughter, nor the sudden pause in the butcher's cheerful whistle as Lady Fenmore passed by with her new companion, a tall, foreign man with a melancholy brow and hands that trembled ever so slightly. "Do you think it will rain, Aunt Jane?" Hester asked, adjusting a plate of seed cake on the table beside her. "Rain?" Miss Marple blinked. "No, my dear. The sky's much too polite for that today." From the bandstand, a warbling flute began the opening notes of Green Sleeves, and old Mrs. Braithwaite, who hadn't missed a harvest fair since 1907, clapped politely. Though slightly off beat. It would have been an entirely ordinary morning in Hollywick, charming and drowsy and neatly predictable, if not for the empty space beneath the ancient yew tree near the chapel gate. That spot, by unspoken village tradition, had always been occupied by Mr. Tobias Rowntree, retired solicitor, passionate beekeeper, and inveterate letter-writer to the Times. His folding chair was nowhere to be seen, nor the battered picnic basket his housekeeper usually packed for him with a single pork pie and a pear. "He's never missed the fair," muttered Mr. Hargrove, the postmaster, scratching his thinning hair. "Not even the year his foot was in plaster," added Miss Lanning, craning her neck. Miss Marple continued knitting. Her brow was smooth, but the needles had paused. She watched as the parish clock struck 11, and the bandstand flutist faltered on a note. In Hollywick Green, absence was never just absence. It was a ripple in the surface of a very still pond, and though no one knew it yet, the water had just begun to stir. The fair had only just reached its comfortable peak, children's hands sticky with barley sugar, a minor scandal averted over a cake competition disqualification, and the vicar's spaniel having successfully stolen a pork bun, when the ripple became a wave. It began with a shout, not loud but panicked in its very restraint. "Mr. Rowntree, someone fetch help." The voice came from young Georgina Pratt, the curate's niece, her face pale beneath a wide-brimmed hat as she stood motionless near the stone wall that marked the edge of the chapel grounds. She'd gone to look for her sketchbook, which she'd accidentally left on a bench beneath the yew. What she found instead had stopped the laughter of children mid-breath, and silenced even the brass band. There, half shrouded by the dappled shadow of the yew tree, was Tobias Rowntree. His tall frame leaned awkwardly back in his folding chair, one hand limp at his side, the other resting on the open lid of his picnic basket. His face, usually flushed with cheerful indignation, was an unfamiliar shade of ashen grey. A slight foam clung to the corner of his lips, and a hornet, attracted by the uneaten pear in his lap, buzzed lazily around his head. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Pritchard let out a gasp that turned into a short, almost indignant sob. The vicar began to walk forward, but hesitated as though unsure of the proper protocol. When approaching a man who had just very clearly died in public, Hester clutched Miss Marple's sleeve. "Jane, he looks." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, rising without haste. "He does indeed." By the time Dr. Elbridge arrived, summoned breathlessly by a boy on a bicycle, the fair had fractured into fragments. The jam stall was abandoned. The raffle had been quietly disassembled. Villagers whispered behind gloves and fans, watching as the doctor knelt beside Mr. Rowntree's lifeless form, and placed a hand gently to his throat. "No pulse," he confirmed grimly. "I'm afraid he's gone." Someone murmured heart attack with cautious relief. But it didn't ring quite right. Mr. Rowntree had never complained of his health, and only the week before had walked 6 miles to inspect a rare hive. Friend kept near Little Denbury. Still, old men died, even in quiet villages. It might have ended there. Grief, condolences, a tasteful burial in the chapel grounds. But then Dr. Elbridge, his brow furrowed, opened the picnic basket. Inside was a plate with half a pork pie, untouched, a flask of elderflower cordial, sealed, a linen napkin, and a second pear, already cut, half-eaten, its pale flesh browned, and beside it, a small glass vial, empty but for a sticky trace of something amber-hued clinging to the rim. The doctor lifted it, sniffed, and grimaced. "I'll need to call the coroner," he said quietly. This may not be natural." A collective inhale swept the crowd like wind in dry grass. Miss Marple, who had remained near the back, glanced toward the empty chair, the fallen knitting needles in her basket, and the place where the hornet now rested on the rim of the pear. "No," she murmured under her breath. "I dare say it isn't natural at all." And in that moment, though no one yet saw it, the first thread of a carefully woven village illusion had begun to unravel. By the following morning, the tranquil lanes of Hollywick Green were alive with a very different sort of energy. Gone was the sleepy contentment that usually followed the village fete, replaced now by an undercurrent of anxious curiosity and something resembling fear, though no one would dare call it that. The death of Tobias Rowntree had spread like spilled ink, staining every doorstep, every teacup, every idle conversation. And, as with all good gossip, the facts had begun to evolve. "He was poisoned, they say," murmured Mrs. Kendall to her neighbor as they lingered suspiciously long outside the greengrocer's. Something in the cordial, or the pear, perhaps, could have been the pie, countered Mr. Wells, who overheard this while pretending to inspect turnips. "He got that pie from the bakery, didn't he? Same one I buy from every Thursday." No, I heard he packed it himself," said Miss Tansey. who'd arrived with her terrier in tow and claimed first-hand knowledge of everything since 1947. Did you know he refused the vicar's wine, said it made him drowsy, thought he'd brought his own elderflower tonic instead. Strange, isn't it? Stranger still were the personal theories that began to crop up, each more speculative than the last. It's that niece of his. What's her name? Ivy? Or Ela? She's been very odd lately, always out walking after dark. Well, you know what they say about men like Mr. Rowntree. He kept to himself. Spoke sharply to the vicar once about the parish roof fund. I remember it clear as Sunday. Bet it's that beekeeper over in Denbury. Tobias had bees too, didn't he? Rivalry gets bitter in that sort of thing. And did you hear? Whispered Mrs. Elcott, the postmistress, as she handed out letters with just a touch too much ceremony. Someone saw him arguing last week, in the chapel yard, with someone not from the village, a stranger. Miss Marple, who had accepted her, led her silently and stepped aside to allow the speculation to continue unimpeded, said nothing. She had, in fact, heard all of it before, from lips of all ages and temperaments. Because human beings, she knew, abhorred a vacuum, especially where explanation should be, and in a place like Hollywick Green. The death of a man under a pear tree during a fete was not just unsettling. It was personal. At the vicarage, Reverend Marrow fielded visits with a strange sort of grace, torn between the pastoral role of comforting the flock and the deeply private worry that this death, so near the heart of church grounds, would cast a long and uncomfortable shadow over his ministry. He had known Tobias since seminary days, or rather, known of him. Their acquaintance had never ripened into true friendship. I wouldn't call him beloved, the vicar confided gently to Miss Marple over a shared pot of tea. Respected, certainly, but he did like to remind people when they were wrong. Miss Marple merely stirred her tea. Yes, she said, and few things are less forgivable than that. In a village. Later, at the library, she observed young Georgina Pratt paging through a volume on toxic plants with poorly concealed interest. When she caught Miss Marple's eye, she blushed and shut the book with a thump, muttering something about research for a painting. Of course, dear, Miss Marple replied kindly. Art and murder do make such peculiar companions, don't they? But it was at the bakery, of all places, where the most curious piece of gossip emerged. He ordered a cherry scone, said Mrs. Beale, flour-dusted and indignant, but then changed his mind, asked for a pear tart instead, said he had a craving for something familiar. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused just briefly. Familiar? Exactly. I thought it odd. He wasn't the nostalgic sort, and he didn't even finish it, said. It didn't taste quite right. Miss Marple murmured a thank you and departed soon after, the phrase looping through her mind like a rhyme. Craving something familiar. Didn't taste quite right. In every whisper, every glance, and every crumb of hearsay, the village was slowly revealing itself, just as it always did. It only remained for someone to listen closely enough, and Miss Marple, it must be said, had always been a very good listener. They came in the morning, of course, as they always did. Not with sirens or spectacle, but in a sober black wolseley that looked more appropriate for a funeral than for an investigation. The gravel of Chapel Hollow's narrow lane crunched beneath its tires as the vehicle drew to a dignified halt outside. The vicarage and two men in serviceable brown coats stepped out. Detective Inspector Armitage had the sort of face that looked permanently unimpressed, with heavy eyebrows and a mustache that seemed to bristle at every fresh observation. Beside him, Sergeant Webb looked more like a young schoolteacher than an officer of the law. Bright-eyed, slightly eager, and already clutching a notebook. They were shown first to the chapel garden, now cordoned off with modest rope and the sort of discreet signs only a village constable would think sufficient for a death scene. The body of Tobias Rowntree had long since been taken away to the county mortuary, but the scene remained otherwise untouched, save for the flattened grass where the man had fallen and a neat little cluster of pear skins, placed strangely beside the bench. "Doesn't look like an accident," muttered Armitage, peering over the scene with a grimace. Not if he was seated and collapsed backward. No bruising, no fall marks. Likely something ingested. Food, drink. Sergeant Webb nodded furiously. The vicar said he brought his own refreshments. "Well then," said Armitage, "let's see who else fed him lies." Their questioning began at the vicarage and spiraled outward like smoke. They spoke to the Reverend first, then the housekeeper, then Miss Bellamy from the flower store, who had been nearest the arbor and swore she saw nothing amiss, only that he looked very pale, and he dropped his napkin, and I remember thinking how odd it was that he didn't pick it up. They questioned Miss Ela Rowntree in her modest cottage. She offered tea, which Armitage declined. Webb accepted, and then quietly set it aside untouched. I hadn't seen Uncle Tobias in several days, Ela said softly, her hands wrapped tightly around her cup. He'd become more distant lately, not cruel, just distracted. He said he had things on his mind. "Did he mention what?" asked Armitage, pen scratching. "No," she replied. "Only that not everyone in this village is who they seem, which I suppose sounds terribly cryptic now." Miss Marple heard about that conversation third hand from the butcher's assistant, who had overheard the sergeant recounting it outside the post office. Gossip, like murder, was never confined at the Hare and Harrow pub. The officers heard from Edwin Talbot, belligerent and red-nosed, who insisted Tobias had made several enemies in the last year. Alone, he was sniffing about that new housing development up on Lavender Rise, Talbot said with a snort. Said it would ruin the view from his orchard. Called it a crime against good taste. "And did that lead to arguments?" asked Webb. "Course it did. He accused our councilman of accepting bribes. Said it aloud, right in the middle of a garden society meeting. Had to be escorted out. Meanwhile, Miss Marple went for her daily walk, passing the chapel, the green, and the little path that led behind the post office. She was not seen near the detectives, nor did she offer an opinion to anyone that day. But she noticed the bees in Rowntree's orchard, strangely quiet for late summer. She noticed, too, that the cottage shutters were closed, all but the upper left one, which was slightly ajar. She noticed everything. That evening, in the reading room of the vicarage. Armitage looked over the gathered notes with the weary air of a man who suspected this might be more trouble than it appeared. "Well?" asked Webb. Hopeful, Armitage grunted. "Could be the niece. Could be the housing squabble. Could be nothing. But he was killed. I'm sure of that. We'll need to bring in Rountree's doctor. Check the autopsy for signs of poison, though I doubt we'll find much. If it was elderflower cordial or pear pie, the traces may be long gone." Webb hesitated. "You don't think it's something more local, more emotional?" Armitage looked at him sideways. "You've been listening to the villagers again. You'll learn soon enough, lad. Murder may live in the heart, but it often hides in the pantry." Outside the vicarage window, Miss Marple strolled past slowly. Her straw had tilted just so, her knitting bag swaying gently at her side. She did not pause. She did not peer in. But her thoughts, it must be said, were already several steps ahead. By the end of the week, the villagers of Hollywick Green had grown tired of whispering about the manner of Tobias Rountree's death, and had begun whispering instead about the manner of his life, which, to many, turned out to be far less saintly than they'd assumed. It was Miss Hartwell from the lending library who first unearthed the quiet scandal. Tobias Rowntree had not returned his books for 3 months, and the overdue notices sent to his orchard estate had gone unanswered. This wouldn't have raised eyebrows on its own, were it not for the particular books in question. To dry legal volumes on land inheritance, and one slim but curious title titled Wills and Contestations, a guide for the bereaved, and belligerent. It didn't help that the solicitor from Nethercombe arrived 2 days later, rather flustered and a little out of breath, with a briefcase full of unsigned papers and a bewildered expression. "Yes," he told Inspector Armitage in a clipped tone. Mr. Rowntree had been planning to revise his will. The paperwork was ready, but he kept delaying the signing. Said he was waiting for something. Waiting for what? The solicitor hesitated. He didn't say, only that the heir wasn't clear yet. I assumed he meant family matters. His niece was due to inherit, as I understood it. But, well, there may have been changes afoot. Do you know who the new beneficiary was to be? Asked Sergeant Webb, ever hopeful. The solicitor merely shook his head. That was the odd part. He wouldn't say. Said naming the heir too soon might put the whole thing in danger. I thought he was being melodramatic. There was a long pause, and now he's dead. Armitage said flatly. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken a walk to the cemetery and had paused near a moss-covered headstone, seemingly for no reason at all. But she wasn't looking at the names. She was looking at the hedgerow behind it, where the children of the village often crept through to gather dropped pears from Tobias Rountree's orchard. Later that afternoon, she asked young Matthew Pruitt, aged 12, earnest, and incurably talkative, whether he had gathered any windfall pears recently. "Yes, Mum," he said proudly. "Me and Alfred got 3 sacks of 'em last Tuesday." "Tuesday," she echoed, feigning forgetfulness. "Not Wednesday?" "No, ma'am, Tuesday. We wouldn't go Wednesday 'cause Mr. Rowntree was always there then. Said he did his thinking on Wednesdays." Miss Marple blinked slowly. "Did he now?" That's rather a good habit. From the grocer's wife came another whisper. Rowntree had been seen arguing with a woman in a dark coat behind the post office. 2 weeks earlier, very heated, she was red in the face, and he just stood there, tight-lipped like he was holding something back. And from the bell ringer's daughter came an even stranger tidbit, that Mr. Rowntree had once offered to pay for her music lessons in the next town, only to retract the offer quietly after someone told him it might be inappropriate. Inappropriate, echoed Miss Marple when she heard it later. No, that's not the word he would have used. Tobias Rowntree cared very much about appearances, but he wasn't a man easily shamed. Someone must have frightened him. The picture emerging was of a man both generous and secretive, a man with intentions veiled beneath layers of decorum. He had once been a beloved benefactor of the annual flower show, but in recent months he had ceased contributing, citing disagreements with the judging panel. He had stopped attending church. He had declined invitations. He had cancelled a long-standing engagement with the Historical Society of Lower Minton, where he was expected to give a talk titled Heirlooms of the Orchard, the pair's place in English law. That, Miss Hartwell said with some indignation, was very unlike him. He adored the sound of his own voice. Yet, despite the growing murk around his final weeks, there was one curious note of constancy. He had visited the chapel garden every Wednesday afternoon, without fail, for the better part of 10 years. Sometimes alone, sometimes with his niece, sometimes with nothing but a thermos of elderflower cordial and a slim notebook, in which he jotted thoughts no one else ever saw. That notebook, it was later discovered, was missing, not taken from his body, for it was never with him the day he died, but missing from his cottage entirely. Odd, said Inspector Armitage, rubbing his jaw. He was a meticulous man. If he had a notebook, it would have a place. It did, said Ela quietly when asked. Top right drawer of his desk. I saw it there just 3 days before. She faltered. You're certain? Webb asked. Yes, she said. He always locked that drawer, but it was unlocked when I went to gather his things. Miss Marple, seated beside a quiet window in her drawing room, continued her knitting. A drawer once locked, she murmured to herself, but left open after death. That's not sloppiness. That's a message from someone who wanted it. To be seen that something had been taken. She didn't smile, but she did, very gently, set down her needles and glanced toward the mantel clock. Wednesday would come again soon, for a day or two. It seemed the village had agreed upon its suspect, not formally. Of course, no one in Hollywick Green ever declared these things outright, but one could trace the arc of suspicion as it passed, from mouth to mouth like a tea biscuit at a funeral, and the name on everyone's tongue, whispered behind doilies and marmalade jars, was Ela Rowntree, Tobias's only living relative, his ward, his niece, his little shadow, as old Mrs. Drayton once called her. She had lived with him since her parents died in a boating accident off Cornwall's jagged coast. When she was 11, she was a lovely girl, quiet, pale, with a gentle voice and an almost unnatural talent for watercolor. But even that, the soft-spoken manner, The delicate manners had begun, in hindsight, to look suspicious. She always seemed rather intense, didn't she? Said Mrs. Merton at the post office. The kind of girl who smiles without showing her teeth. You know the type. Bit of a recluse, added Reverend Hale's wife, folding a postcard in half. Even as a child, she had odd little obsessions. Once spent a whole summer painting pears. Well, wouldn't you? Said Miss Hartwell. If your inheritance depended on it. That was the thing, wasn't it? The will, or rather, the unsigned revision. The solicitor had confirmed that the original document, which left the bulk of the Rowntree estate to Ela, was still legally in place. And with Tobias now dead, and no new signature anywhere in sight, the house, the orchard, and every last banknote in his account would soon be hers. It's almost too neat, said Sergeant Webb to Inspector Armitage over pints at the Swan. And Thistle, inheritance, means proximity. She's even the one who found him, or says she did. Armitage grunted. Motives there, sure, but the method's messy. You'd think a clever girl like her could manage something a little cleaner. You mean not half burying him in rose thorns? I mean not letting the whole blasted village find the body. Poison would have done. And that, quietly and dangerously, became the story the village started to believe. That sweet, strange Ela had finally snapped. That Tobias, perhaps controlling, perhaps cruel, had pushed her too far, and she'd lashed out in a fit of rage. That maybe she hadn't meant to kill him. That maybe the rose arbor was a panic, a cover-up, a moment of madness. Only Miss Marple, sipping tea in the drawing room of Mrs. Weatherby's that afternoon, appeared to consider the theory with an inward frown. Girls who snap, she said gently, do not usually take the time to fold their uncle's coat and hang it back on the peg, nor do they cover a body with roses rather than dirt. No, that's someone who wanted it seen, not hidden. Someone making a performance. Mrs. Weatherby blinked. A performance. Jane Marple nodded. You see, the roses wouldn't have covered the body unless they'd been cut, and no one noticed missing flowers. So someone clipped blooms just for the arrangement. It's too poetic. But Ela does paint, Mrs. Weatherby ventured. She's terribly artistic. Perhaps. Marple said softly, but art is intention. And if Ela wanted to make a display, she wouldn't have fled. She would have waited to be discovered, paintbrush in hand. The idea unsettled Mrs. Weatherby enough that she burned the toast. Still, the police kept close to Ela. She was gently questioned, gently warned not to leave the village, and gently avoided by nearly everyone. At Sunday service, she remained in the cottage, curtains drawn, painting nothing at all. Miss Marple, meanwhile, began to walk. She visited the rose arbor again, though she did not linger there. She asked about Tobias's favorite brands of tea. She learned from the butcher's boy that Tobias had stopped ordering bacon 5 weeks before his death. She noted that the grocer's order included tinned kippers, something Ela reportedly loathed, and she visited Mrs. Stratton, Tobias's housekeeper of 17 years, who had abruptly resigned 2 weeks before the incident. He didn't like to be contradicted. The woman told her plainly, thought he knew best about everyone and everything. He changed. Miss Marple, in the last few months, grew secretive, short-tempered. He'd mutter to himself, said things weren't safe. Did he ever say what he feared? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Stratton hesitated. Not aloud. But I found him once in the cellar, with a lantern and a small box. When I asked what he was doing, he snapped, said it was private. I shouldn't be. Asked, a box, a locked one, small. He carried it back up. I never saw it again. And did Ela know? She wasn't home that day. Gone painting at the pond, I think. But she noticed something had changed. I could tell. That night, Miss Marple lay awake longer than usual. The ticking of her bedside clock louder than it should have been. She watched the shadows cross the ceiling and thought of roses and cellars and girls who smiled without showing their teeth. Ela may have had cause, but she did not have character, and someone in Hollywick Green was playing a far more elegant game than a girl with a paintbrush. And a secret could manage alone. It was on the following Tuesday. Overstewed quinces and walnut scones at the vicarage, that Miss Marple began to gather the threads, not with direct inquiry. Heavens no. That would have startled the conversation into stillness. Instead, she did what she always did. She listened. The vicar's wife, an earnest and gently fretful woman named Hester Lindale, had invited a small gathering for afternoon tea. Miss Marple, of course, and Mrs. Penelope Stratton still a bit tremulous about having spoken to the police. Mrs. Weatherby, who considered herself a vital conduit of village information, and young Miss Claire Featherstone, who taught piano at the rectory on Thursdays and knew far too much about everyone's children. The talk, as always, began innocuously. Quilting patterns, the lack of rain, the new milkman's regrettable sideburns. But as the hour stretched and the second pot of tea was poured, conversation, as it often did in Hollywick Green, took a more suggestive turn. Of course, said Mrs. Weatherby, breaking a scone in half with the solemnity of a vicar reading psalms. He was very exacting. Tobias, I mean. One couldn't just drop in on him. Not like the old days. Exacting. Miss Marple asked mildly, dabbing at a stray crumb. Oh yes, Hester nodded. He insisted on appointments for the oddest things. Wouldn't see. The vicar without writing ahead. And once, I remember this clearly, he refused to take a parcel unless the postman announced himself properly. Claire smiled faintly. He was a stickler, but there's more to it than eccentricity, don't you think? My mother said he'd grown afraid, that he kept candles stocked in every room, worried about power cuts or something more dramatic. Mrs. Stratton, silent until now, cleared her throat. He started bolting the doors in the daytime. That turned heads. The daytime? Asked Hester, eyes wide. Mrs. Stratton nodded. Yes, after lunch. He said it was safer. He wouldn't. Safe from what? Just looked out the window a great deal. Always toward the fields. And Ela? Asked Miss Marple softly. Did she share his concerns? Not openly, but she seemed tense. There was a morning when I brought her tea and found her at the writing desk, tearing up something. A letter, I think. She said it was rubbish, but she was pale, unwell. Really? Did she speak much to the villagers? Miss Marple asked. Not often, said Claire. But she spoke to me, now and then. We both spent time at the Arboretum. She said she felt safest among plants, that they didn't expect her to smile. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something settled behind her eyes. A quiet awareness, plants, safety, torn letters, bolted doors, and a body hidden beneath a rose arbor. Later that week, she joined the monthly meeting of the Hollywick Green Ladies' Preservation Circle, held in the reading room at the back of the church. There were 15 women present, each more determined than the last to preserve things nobody under 50 remembered. Stone walls, mothballs, jam jar labels in Latin. It was, in many ways, a perfect arena for listening, between discussions of heritage herbs and fundraising for a new church lectern. The matter of Tobias Rowntree crept in. You know, said Miss Agnes Crane, who once published a small book of botanical illustrations, and considered herself a scholar of the symbolic flora of death. Roses are a peculiar choice for concealment. Too vivid, they draw attention. But it's romantic, isn't it? Said young Mrs. Draper, sighing. If you were going to die, wouldn't you want to be buried under roses? That wasn't a burial, snapped Mrs. Ellicott. That was display. Display, Miss Marple repeated quietly, knitting her needles into a smooth rhythm. Do you suppose the choice of flower meant something? Well, said Agnes with a sniff, the rose is too commonly used to mean anything at all. But if you must ask, thorns mean protection or defense. That much I know. It was a curious thought. Roses to defend a body, or perhaps roses to frame one dot at the edge of the room. No one had noticed Mrs. Merriweather's nervous glance toward the window, nor the fact that she excused herself early, clutching a small velvet pouch in one hand and whispering something about catching the post. But Miss Marple noticed. She also noticed, in passing, that one of the women, Margaret Ellicott, had recently begun wearing a new brooch. A curious little thing, a brass pear-shaped pendant with tiny enamel leaves. New, but old-fashioned, sentimental, unremarkable to most. But Miss Marple had a memory for such things, and she remembered that Tobias Rowntree had once had a similar piece on his study mantel. A gift, perhaps, or a token. It was gone now, of course, not mentioned in the police inventory. The threads were beginning to knot themselves, not into a shape yet, but into a tension. There was, Miss Marple thought, a story beneath the story, and it was slowly, gently, beginning to speak. It was a Wednesday morning, draped in that peculiar English drizzle, not quite rain, not quite mist, when Miss Marple made her quiet way to the Hollywick Green post office. Not for any urgent correspondence, of course. Her letters were always written on Sundays, sealed on Mondays, and sent on Tuesdays. But routine, she had long understood, was best camouflaged by breaking it now and then. The postmistress, Winifred Cole, was no gossip in the traditional sense. Her lips were thin and tightly drawn, and her conversations rarely wandered past the weight of parcels or the price of stamps. But her silences were revealing. One nearly had to ask the right question and watch what she didn't say. I do hope the Rowntree accounts haven't disrupted your routine too much, Miss Marple said, folding a sheet of unposted note paper in her hands. Winifred blinked. Accounts? The inspectors? Police do so like to ask about parcels sent and received, don't they? I suppose Tobias Rowntree kept you rather busy. Winifred looked away just a moment too long. Not really. He hardly posted anything. A man of paper, not packages. But his sister, a pause. Oh, she sent flowers, regularly, dried, pressed, to a cousin in Dorset. How lovely, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes on the rack of greeting cards. What sort of flowers? Difficult to say. They were always wrapped in muslin and sealed in brown paper. But one parcel was returned last week, damaged in the rain. The return address smudged. I put it in the back room. I imagine the flowers didn't survive. Winifred gave a short laugh. No, soggy pulp by the time I opened it. But I remember the paper it was wrapped in. Pages from a gardening catalogue. Rose hybrids, second bloom cycle. I thought that rather funny. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, very curious indeed. It wasn't the flowers that interested her, nor the soggy return. It was the catalogue. Tobias Rowntree, for all his rose mania, would never have let a catalogue page go to waste like that. Not for something as messy as packaging. He annotated everything, according to Penelope Stratton. Margins filled with thoughts, cross-references, even poems, someone had said. And yet, here was a catalogue page used as scrap. Later that afternoon, she took a stroll near the church gate, just as the villages to schoolboys, Thomas Greaves and Edwin Flack, whizzed past on their bicycle, less arguing over who'd stolen the better apple from Mr. Daltrey's orchard. Miss Marple barely noticed the commotion. She was focused on a half-torn paper caught in the privet hedge. She plucked it gently and smoothed it with gloved fingers. Of course the roses won't survive a second pruning. Not with the rootstock weakened. Suggest you move the pear bench. By September and dig. She folded the fragment with care and tucked it into her coat. A gardening note, but not Tobias's handwriting. That was certain. His hand was careful, looping, faintly aristocratic. This was slanted and quick, nervous, masculine. Miss Marple was not one to make leaps without foundations, but she could not ignore that the pear bench, which sat just beside the rose arbor, had in fact been moved. Mrs. Stratton had mentioned it only yesterday. They shifted it a week or so before Tobias died. She'd said casually, said it blocked the sun too much for the dahlias. Miss Marple had smiled at the time, but inside, something had hardened like cooling jam. If the rose arbor was a hiding place, and the pear bench had been in the way, and someone wanted it removed, then someone had known in advance what would happen, or what they planned to do. That night, in the quiet of her parlor, Miss Marple laid out a small collection of seemingly unconnected things. A pear-shaped brooch, a water-damaged catalogue page, a torn scrap from a hedge, and a list of gardening habits Tobias Rowntree had spoken of to no one except Ela. One clue might be a coincidence. Two, a curiosity. but three. Three pointed to a plan. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth settle her thoughts. And somewhere beneath the roses of Hollywick Green, truth was blooming, quiet and thorned. The rain stopped sometime in the early morning hours, leaving Hollywick Green soft underfoot and glinting with dew. The sun, pale and polite, cast long shadows across the hedgerows as if unwilling to disturb what lingered there. To the casual visitor, the village looked unchanged. Church bells chimed faintly in the distance, and children chased hoops down the lane. But to anyone with a practiced eye, the mood had shifted. Suspicion had seeped into the soiled dot at the butcher's. Voices lowered when names were mentioned. At the greengrocer's, glances were exchanged across bins of parsnips and carrots, and at the bakery. The morning queue for bread lingered a little longer, not for lack of loaves, but for the juicy offerings of hearsay and implication. He was poisoned, mark my words, said Mrs. Calthrop, her nose reddened by the cold. You don't just fade away from too much gardening, not at that age. Well, he was looking ill for months, replied Alice Jennings, with a little purse of her lips. And I heard from my cousin at the surgery that he'd refused tests. Refused. Or was told not to bother, asked Mrs. Calthrop, pointedly. Miss Marple, seated on the bench outside the pharmacy with her knitting bag and a modest length of pink yarn, made no remark. She had learned long ago that the quietest place to listen was beside the noisiest mouths. Inside the vicarage, Reverend Hale wrestled with more private dilemmas. He had received a note, unsigned, folded discreetly into the collection box after Sunday service, that read simply, "Ask your daughter where she was when the bell didn't ring." He stared at it now on his desk, palms pressed flat against the blotter. Lucy had said she'd gone out walking that morning, alone, as she often did, and had returned breathless, claiming the bell must have rung early. But it hadn't. The bell was never early, and Lucy had been distracted of late, distant, writing letters and then tearing them up, crying when she thought no one saw. Was it grief for Tobias or guilt? He would not ask her, not yet, not while he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Meanwhile, Penelope Stratton had taken to rearranging the furniture in her late employer's drawing room, not just to occupy her hands, though they trembled with purpose, but to change the space, to erase something unsaid. She could still hear his voice in that room, still feel the press of his gaze. But it was more than memory that haunted her. It was the secret that had passed between them that final week. The argument no one knew about, the disagreement about Ela, about the will, about moral duty. She had said too much, or not enough, and now she feared that someone else knew. As Penelope shifted the heavy settee toward the hearth, a folded scrap of paper fluttered from beneath the cushion. She picked it up with gloved fingers. A poem, in Tobias's handwriting. 4 lines only. Where roses grow, the truth is kept. In roots, where bitter secrets slept. The arbor knows what none confess, and silence blooms from loveliness. Her knees nearly gave way. She burned it in the fireplace without reading it again. Back on the green, Miss Marple stood and smoothed her skirt. She had counted 7 references. to the rose arbor in Idle Village chatter this week, far more than chance would suggest. It had been Tobias's pride and joy, yes, but now it seemed to loom in people's minds with something like fear, and people were watching each other. That, too, had changed. Mr. Flint's eyes followed Mrs. Rowley's every move. Nora Hastings clutched her handbag more tightly when she passed young Edwin Flack. Even kind Dr. Weatherby seemed uneasy when he caught sight of Isla's bicycle, propped outside the vicarage gate. So many eyes, so much watching. But few were watching Miss Marple. She walked unnoticed, listened without drawing attention, and was regarded, mostly, as a dear old lady with too much time and a fondness for Rose. Hip tea, which suited her just fine, because while the village looked one way, toward gossip, toward speculation, she was looking elsewhere, toward a motive that had nothing to do with inheritance or envy, and everything to do with love. By Tuesday afternoon, the village of Hollywick Green had reached what the local postmaster, Mr. Needham, described with a grim sort of relish as a full boil. Theories had crystallized, suspicions hardened, and nearly everyone, save for one quiet woman with soft eyes and sharper instincts, was convinced they knew who had done it. The name on every whispered lip was Edwin Flack, young, nervous, and not entirely respectable in the eyes of Hollywick matrons. Edwin had long been a tolerated presence in the village, mostly due to his mother's good standing and his late father's reputation for honesty at the parish council. But Edwin himself had always been something of a puzzle. He worked odd jobs, borrowed books from the vicar's library, but rarely returned them, and kept company with those motorcycle sorts from Brixham. He was also known to spend an inordinate amount of time sketching near the rose arbor. His drawings were private, and the few glimpses offered abstract swirls. Somber faces had only further distanced him from the tidy sensibilities of Hollywick. But the crucial fact, repeated endlessly now in corners of shops and between fresh linen at the washing line, was this: Edwin Flack had been seen near Tobias Linton's house the morning he died. "It's always the quiet ones," muttered Mr. Prowse, the grocer, handing over a bag of seedless grapes to Mrs. Featherly. "The ones with notebooks and sad eyes, mark my words." Even Sergeant Blunt had begun to show signs of certainty, having spent a fruitless afternoon at the Flack's cottage examining Edwin's cluttered bedroom, which yielded little more than charcoal smudges and worn paperbacks. But then came the real discovery: a single glove, coarse wool, tucked into the pocket of Edwin's overcoat. It matched the pair Tobias was known to wear while gardening. That was all it took. A simple object, vague in context, became an anchor for a swelling tide of assumption. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She had seen Edwin at the post office not long before Tobias's death, mailing a letter, eyes downcast, posture slouched, and she remembered the date because of the envelope. The stamp was French, a small rarity in Hollywick. It bore an iris and a faint perfume. Miss Marple noticed such things. She noticed, too, that Edwin had lingered outside the post office longer than necessary, as though deciding whether to go home or disappear. And then there was the peculiar scene that morning on the green. When Edwin encountered Lucy Hale near the fountain and had, rather clumsily, handed her something wrapped in brown paper, Lucy had recoiled, but taken it. All of this was dismissed by others as awkward youth or romantic embarrassment. But to Miss Marple, it was too deliberate to be meaningless. The boy had secrets, certainly, but secrets did not equate to murder. Nevertheless, the tide was against him. Mrs. Flack, red-eyed and trembling, called on Miss Marple that evening. Holding a teacup with both hands as if it might steady her. "He didn't do anything," she whispered. He's strange. Yes, but he's kind. Always kind. He cried when the dog died last spring. He sends me flowers on my birthday. He couldn't hurt a soul." Miss Marple nodded softly, her knitting needles quiet in her lap. "I believe you," she said gently. But belief wasn't enough. Not when the sergeant had begun hinting at formal charges. Not when the villagers had, in their collective comfort, already decided that Edwin's difference made him dangerous. And not when Edwin himself, cornered and panicked, had gone missing, gone, without word or farewell, sometime between dusk and dawn. That morning, his bicycle was found abandoned behind the bakery. His knapsack, empty, lay beside it. It was, of course, taken as proof of guilt. But Miss Marple, as she trimmed a stalk of lavender and watched the clouds shift above St. Mildred's spire, thought otherwise. Running was often a sign of fear, but not always of wrongdoing. Sometimes it was fear of not being believed, or worse, fear of becoming the next body beneath the arbor. By the time Thursday arrived, the village of Hollywick Green had begun to exhale, not out of relief, but out of exhaustion. Rumor had spent itself hoarse. Children had been instructed not to speak of the business at supper. Even Mrs. Denham, who usually delighted in drawing out conspiracies over crumpets, found herself merely sighing over the sugar bowl. Sergeant Blunt remained convinced that Edwin Flack's disappearance was as good as a confession. The glove, the sketches, the awkwardness, it all fit into his tidy box of motive and means. He would have, by that very evening, issued a formal warrant, had he someone to deliver it to. But Miss Marple had begun walking more slowly through the village, not out of infirmity, but deliberation. Her gentle smile remained, but her eyes narrowed often, especially near the gate of Roseview Cottage, for it was there, late that evening, that the second disturbance unfolded. It was Lucy Hale who found it, not quite a body, but nearly. She had gone down to the garden shed, trailing her mother's blue shawl behind her, intending to fetch the old flower press for a craft fair. She had expected dust, perhaps a mouse. What she found instead was a handkerchief drenched in blood, folded precisely, deliberately placed atop a stack of gardening books that hadn't been touched in years, and beneath that, a torn page from one of Edwin's sketchbooks, the pencil lines thick, frantic, a face half screaming, half laughing, and in the margin, scrawled hurriedly, "He asked to be buried under the pear tree." Lucy screamed. It wasn't the blood that had terrified her. It was the neatness of it. The way it felt like someone had left it for her to find. Within the hour, the constables had swept the garden behind Roseview. Lanterns moved like ghosts between the hedgerows. And then they found something more chilling still, a fresh mound of earth beneath the bishop's old pear tree. The soil was turned, not hastily, but not professionally either. A small pile of broken roots sat beside it. When they dug, they found a body. Not Tobias Linton. No, his had already been claimed by coroner and rumor alike. This body was far more decomposed, too far gone to recognize by face, but not by clothing. Miss Marple, when summoned by Sergeant Blunt, didn't ask to see the corpse. She merely requested the contents of its pockets. There was a single button, brass, ornate, the sort used in military dress coats from the late 19th century, and in a rotted inner coat pocket, a sodden, faded photograph to boys standing in front of the rectory gate, grinning foolishly at the camera, arms around each other. One of them was a young Tobias Linton. The other was unmistakably the late Reverend Selwyn Croft, who had vanished a decade ago, reportedly having retired to a mission in India. But Miss Marple remembered otherwise. She remembered, particularly, the strange note left behind at the time. I go to find peace beneath his gaze. That had always sounded less like a missionary's farewell, and more like a farewell of another kind. Entirely the village reeled once more, to deaths, one fresh, one buried in time, and suddenly nothing. Felt certain. Edwin's guilt, once so loudly proclaimed, now felt tenuous again. How did a man vanish for 10 years only to be found beneath a fruit tree, in a garden shed frequented by gossips? And why had no one missed him, or had someone ensured they didn't? As the lanterns flickered out and the villagers returned to their hearths, Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched, her eyes fixed beyond the firelight, reflected something like sorrow, because now the puzzle had grown darker. The murders were no longer about jealousy or youth. They were, she feared, about memory and the terrible things people did to erase. The following morning dawned grey, the sort of pale, colourless light that seemed to dull even the chirping of the sparrows. Mist hovered low in the hedgerows and curled round the eaves of cottages, as though the village itself wished to conceal its own face for a while. Miss Marple sat before her small breakfast table, the eggs cooling on their plate, the tea left to steep too long. Her knitting needles rested unused in her lap. She was not cross, nor frightened, but she was remembering, and memory, as she knew, was the most delicate and dangerous tool of all. There had been to crimes now, to bodies, one fresh, one old, and to names that threaded through both, Tobias Linton and Reverend Selwyn Croft. She'd known Reverend Croft when he first arrived, sharp-chinned, serious, and a little too eager to speak of righteousness. His sermons had lacked warmth. His eyes had been more searching than kind. And then, one day, he had simply vanished. No funeral, no farewell, just a vague letter and silence ever since. And Tobias Linton, a man who had returned after 20 years away, claiming nostalgia, but carrying a mind so jittery and distracted that Miss Marple had instinctively wondered, not what he was seeking, but what he was running from. But it wasn't until she visited the parish records that morning Under the pretense of researching flower rot in 1890s gardens, that something clicked. There had never been a record of Reverend Croft departing for India, not in the diocese records, nor in the mission's registry. What had been found, however, folded deep into the 1913 vestry logbook, was a signed confession, not addressed to anyone, just a single torn page tucked between the accounts for candle wax and pew polish. What one man hides in silence, another may dig up with his guilt. I did not intend to kill him, but I was not sorry that I had. There was no name, no date, but the handwriting. Miss Marple had seen it before. In a birthday card sent to Miss Barton last spring, in a label on a jar of quince jelly. It was the hand of Edwin Flack. She returned home without speaking a word of it. The police would not understand, not yet. There was more to know, more to watch. But something else disturbed her, something that had been troubling the edges of her mind. Ever since Tobias's fall beneath the rose arbor, he had not been pushed in anger. He had been startled enough to lose balance, to fall, and to die. But what could startle a man enough? To stumble backwards without warning, not a person, not a weapon, a word, a name, perhaps, or worse, a voice from a past he believed safely buried. The placement of the second body, under the bishop's pear tree, was not random. No one would dig there by accident. Someone had wanted it found. But not until now, which meant someone had planted the bloodied handkerchief on purpose, left the sketchbook page precisely to rattle nerves, a theatrical gesture, but not for show. No, for message. To whom? Not to the police, not to Lucy Hale, but to Miss Marple. Someone was drawing her in. She thought again of Edwin's strange absence, of how tidy the clue had been, how his guilt had risen too easily, like cream skimmed off a pot, floating on the surface, while something darker churned beneath. And then she saw it, all of it. The pattern was not about rage, not about passion. It was about control, about keeping things buried, about selecting what history deserved to remain remembered, and what should be allowed to rot beneath. Inspector Lorimer will be here in a moment. I invited him, too. It's always best to talk these things through properly, outside. The faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. Malcolm didn't flee. He simply deflated like a man surrendering to a tide he could no longer outswim. I didn't mean to kill either of them, he whispered. I believe you, said Miss Marple gently, but the truth has its own requirements. The front gate clicked open, and in that quiet sitting room, surrounded by daffodils and cooling tea, the trap Miss Marple had set, with biscuits, conversation, and a string of quiet deductions, snapped shut with the gentlest grace imaginable. The drawing room was silent save for the tick of the mantel clock, and the soft rustle of Inspector Lorimer removing his gloves. Malcolm Stanning sat stiffly in the armchair, as if afraid that movement might break the fragile illusion of dignity still left to him. Miss Marple poured a fresh cup of tea, with the calm of a hostess who had weathered many storms, and preferred them civilized. The inspector, tall and quietly worn, with lines that deepened when frustrated, glanced between them. You sent for me, Miss Marple. Yes, she said, stirring her tea. I thought it best we talk plainly. Stanning gave no resistance, only silence. Lorimer sat forward, the polished leather creaking beneath him. Mr. Stanning, I'm told you may know something about the death of Tobias Linton, and perhaps about Reverend Croft, who disappeared 20 years ago. Malcolm lifted his head. Croft's death wasn't planned, he said. Tobias, that was different. The inspector nodded slowly, encouraging Miss Marple kept her eyes lowered, gently turning her knitting needles. The Reverend was found behind the bishop's pear tree, wasn't he? Buried shallowly. A gardener would have noticed the difference in soil. You knew the vicarage garden well. That made Malcolm look up. How did you? You mentioned it once. At the garden fete last year, you said you missed those soft pears the bishop's tree produced, even if the roots always got in the way of planting. She smiled faintly. Odd thing to say about a man's private orchard. Unless you knew it intimately. Unless you dug beneath it. Stanning's composure cracked just slightly. Lorimer seized the moment. Mr. Stanning, are you confessing to the deaths of both men? No. His voice was ragged, only to hiding Croft. He slipped. It was an argument, a push. He hit his head on the stone trough. It was raining. I was frightened. And Linton, I didn't. I didn't want to kill him. I tried to reason with him. I thought. He faltered. But when he threatened to go to the papers, to bring it all down, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed beneath her lace-trimmed hat. You met him in the rose arbor, didn't you? That's where he felt safest. But you brought the walking stick. Not for your gout, I dare say. A pause. And then the smallest betrayal, the smallest slip. Malcolm murmured. He never saw it coming. The inspector blinked. Pardon? But Miss Marple had heard it. A phrase no one had offered before. Not in any newspaper. Not in village gossip. He never saw it coming. Only the killer would know that Dotmer. Stanning realized it too late. His hand trembled again. His eyes clouded. That's always how it is, Miss Marple said softly, more to herself than anyone. A word, a turn of phrase. We don't mean to give ourselves away, but language has its loyalties. We tell the truth whether we mean to or not. The inspector stood slowly. Mr. Stanning, I'll need you to come with me now. Malcolm didn't resist. As he rose. He looked around the cozy room, the polished silver, the ticking clock, the faded blue floral wallpaper. He seemed a man seeing everything for the last time, or perhaps for the first. And then he was gone, led gently out through the white garden gate, where the daffodils bowed in the breeze. Miss Marple remained seated, pouring herself one last cup of tea. She didn't gloat. She didn't sigh. She simply picked up her knitting again. The pattern needed steady fingers, and let the silence settle like mist over Hollywick Green. The following afternoon, the villagers gathered in the stone nave of St. Etheldreda's church, not for a funeral this time, but for answers. Inspector Lorimer had requested the space, neutral ground. He'd said, though Miss Marple suspected, it was the vaulted ceiling and ancient echo that gave him courage. Reverend Phelps had reluctantly approved the use, his young face pale, his hands trembling as he lit the last candle near the chancel. Truth had a weight to it, and in Hollywick Green, That weight had grown too heavy to keep indoors. The pews were filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Danforth, gripping her gloves too tightly, Major Banbury, frowning with military skepticism, Constance Furlong, her painted lips compressed into a slash. Even young Timothy Wells, sitting beside his mother, with unusually quiet eyes. Malcolm Stanning was not there. He sat in custody at the nearby station, his confession recorded, his fate sealed with no more ceremony than a closed notebook and a nod from the sergeant. Miss Marple, small and unassuming in her navy blue, stood beside the inspector as he cleared his throat. "There are things to be said," he began, "and while we won't pretend to understand every shadow of the heart, we believe we can now account for the deaths of both Tobias Linton and, long ago, Reverend Leonard Croft." He gestured to Miss Marple. She did not step forward, but instead turned, slowly, to address the congregation, not like a magistrate, but as if offering tea and a story. It began, of course, not with murder, she said, but with shame. Reverend Croft, you see, had discovered something, or believed he had. A relationship, of sorts, between a young man and another, inappropriate in the church's eyes. He threatened to expose it, to have the man removed from the seminary altogether. She paused. There was an argument, a fall, not premeditated, I believe, but fatal. Mr. Stanning buried the body beneath the bishop's pear tree. Perhaps it felt poetic. At the time, a ripple moved through the pews. Gasps, murmurs, the crinkle of disbelief colliding with the familiar rhythm of Marple's calm voice. Time passed. He became a respected man, built the garden center, took care of his mother. But secrets, as they do, rot beneath the surface. She folded her hands gently. When Tobias Linton arrived, newly wealthy, newly meddlesome, he began researching Reverend Croft for a biography. He stumbled upon the inconsistencies, the vicar's abrupt transfer, the missing diary, the purchase records of soil and lime. He confronted Malcolm, not to go to the police, no, but to pressure him for money, for influence, for leverage, perhaps even out of revenge. She looked to the altar flowers, roses, their petals beginning to curl at the edges. They met beneath the rose arbor. Tobias underestimated how far a man might go when cornered not by law, but by memory. Malcolm brought the walking stick not for support, but for certainty. The silence in the church was deep enough to be holy. He struck Tobias once, swiftly, the kind of act that surprises even the one who commits it. He buried him hastily, but it was Constance Furlong who found the torn cuff, and Mrs. Danforth who heard something in the bushes, and young Timothy who remembered the smell of blood. Miss Marple's voice softened further, and me, I listened. I remembered words. People forget that language tells on us long before our actions do. Mr. Stanning spoke of the arbor as if he'd seen its inside, when he claimed he hadn't. He recalled what Tobias never saw coming. Small things. Always small things. Lorimer finally stepped forward again. Mr. Stanning has confessed to both acts. The law will take its course, but the village must reckon with its own silence. For years, we let a ghost walk beneath the pears, and last week, We let a man die for fear of him. Nobody clapped. Nobody nodded. They simply sat in stillness, in reflection, as the late afternoon light poured in through the stained glass window, striking the floor like a confession. No one had asked for, and no one could deny. Miss Marple reached into her handbag for a wrapped sweet. She placed it gently in her mouth and savored the quiet. The days that followed moved with the muted hush of morning, though no bells tolled, and no bunting was lowered. Hollywick Green did not mourn with garlands or processions. Instead, it recoiled inwards, as though the truth itself had left a bruise. The rose and compass, usually alight with cheerful gossip, and the clink of pint glasses, remained eerily subdued. Patrons spoke in lowered voices, if they spoke at all. Edith Danforth no longer occupied her corner booth. Her usual schedule of tea, treacle tart, and tart commentary replaced with long, unexplained absences. Word had it she'd gone to stay with a niece in Surrey. Others said she simply couldn't bear to look at the garden centre again. Major Banbury, who had once boomed about standards and military clarity, now walked with a slower tread, nodding politely but never stopping to talk. He had backed Malcolm's business, after all, had shared cards and brandy with him. It wasn't betrayal that dulled the old soldier's eyes. It was bafflement that a man could kill and carry on, pruning roses and setting bulbs, without so much as a tremor in his voice. Timothy Wells, who had idolized both Malcolm and the idea of manhood he'd represented, had begun avoiding town altogether. His mother, Margaret, returned to knitting with fierce, angry concentration. The threads pulled too tight. She had looked to Miss Marple once, as if to ask, "How could you know?" But the question never left her lips. The boy, she feared, had learned something far crueler than murder, that idols are rarely hollow by accident. Constance Furlong, with her sharply drawn eyebrows and velvet gloves, refused to attend.